Okay, I think we're all in. William, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks, Loic. Thanks everybody for coming along to this. It's a great pleasure to host it. The report is launching. Loic and Rod will talk about it in a minute, but it's worth saying there's a lot of calls for kind of sweeping changes to assessment at the moment, like abolishing GCSEs. But what struck me is just how this is looking at the grassroots change that's already happening, why it's happening, and the nitty-gritty of how to make it work. So you'll hear more about it, but I think it should provide some great inspiration. So just a quick running order of what we're going to do today. In a minute, Loic Menzies, Chief Executive of the Centre for Education and Youth, and Rob Bristow from Pearson UK will introduce the report and the findings. Then later, after that, we're going to have responses from Rob Coe, Professor Rob Coe, the Director of Research and Development at the Evidence-Based Education, and a Senior Associate at the Education Endowment Foundation. And we're also going to have responses from Mary Myatt, the Education Advisor and Chair of the Centre for Education and Youth. After that, we're going to have a Q&A. So if you've got questions as you hear about this report, then please put them in the chat, and then we will put them to the experts. And then after that, we're going to follow that up with some breakout sessions. So I'd like to hand over to Loic to talk through to Loic and Rod to talk through the report.
Great, thank you so much. And it's really wonderful to have you all here as we launch this report. And what I wanted to do, I think, right now is to start off by telling you a little bit about why we did this report, where it came from, and then move on to talk about a key tension that sits at the heart of this report and what we've tried to do to resolve that and why we think that's going to be useful to the sector. So the starting point for this is that clearly assessment is a key pillar of teaching. It provides the information that teachers need to shape their teaching. It helps them understand the misconceptions that pupils might have, and it boosts pupils' progress. But unfortunately, it's become a bit of a monster in many ways. For far too much of the time, it becomes an instrument of compliance, and people find themselves just constantly feeding this data monster. And research published by Professor John Jerram just last week showed that when you look at all the different activities that teachers do, marking is actually the one that has the most negative impact on their well-being. And that's something that's really familiar to me because I taught in a school where the marking policy, if I was to comply with it, would actually have taken me 15 hours a week to do that. And I knew just how much of a negative impact that would have on me as a teacher. But the exciting thing about this project is that it allows us to look at teachers who are taking that challenge on. And what we've done is we've tried to include a real mix of educationalists in that project, and you're going to hear from lots of them today. So we've got teachers who have decided, like Rosie here, to build partnerships outside of school, bringing artists into support their pupils. We've got MATs represented by Robin Shakespeare here, who've decided to ditch the data drops. We've got countries like New Zealand that are really supporting teachers at a national level to make better use of assessment. And we've got schools like Benchworth Academy, who you'll be able to hear from later too, for really finding new tools that they can use through Impact Ed to support their pupils' development. So there's really exciting stuff going on to take on this big challenge. And that's why we've decided to design the session today in the way that we have, so that you'll be able to go into these breakout rooms and hear from practitioners. Because that was the ethos behind this whole project. We started off with a crowdsourcing campaign, getting to hear from teachers themselves, coming up with solutions from the ground up. The problem is that takes us to a tension that sits at the heart of this report, and something that we found really tricky as we were working on this. And that's what this tension is about. It's all about agency and freedom, what we're saying. We're saying that teachers have should have a professional autonomy to make great decisions about assessment. So they should have that freedom. The problem is that innovation can often go wrong. And we know, I think it's Dylan William who often talks about how if you let 1,000 flowers bloom, you soon have a lot of those flowers that don't flourish. And when we've got pupils involved in this, then that can cause serious consequences for them. So this report is actually all about innovating with responsibility. We've been trying all along to solve that tension because it's been really hard to represent that. But one way I think about understanding that is by analogy. And so those of you who know me or who maybe follow me on Twitter will know that apart from doing research, I do a lot of rock climbing. And that really, for me, provides a really helpful analogy to understand how we've solved this tension. Because a lot of people think that climbing is all about taking risks. It's about being a daredevil. People have seen the pictures of people climbing up mountains without ropes and things. But that's not what climbing's about. It's not actually just about taking risks. It's about managing risks. So when you're about to do a difficult move or you're doing something dangerous, it's all about working out how to do that safely. And the idea behind this report is that we're trying to give people ways of doing that safely. So we're helping people to innovate with responsibility. And we show people how to do that. So we've got a number of recommendations we make in here. We encourage people to prepare to innovate. So learn more about assessment, be curious about it, find out from other teachers and schools like the ones who are here today, how they've been solving these problems. Think really carefully about the purpose that assessment serves in each different instance. And Daisy Christodoulou has been talking about this a long time, saying that a lot of the problems from assessment come because of it trying to serve multiple purposes at the same time and ending up doing all of them badly. So think about the purpose every time. Consider what level to innovate at. So if you see the way we've structured this report, we featured the teacher level, the school level, the group of school, and the country. And there's different levels at which innovation can take place. And we found some really interesting things. For example, that when you do assessment at department level, it can work really well. And that makes sense because assessment is actually quite subject specific in many disciplines. And so doing it at a department level actually allows you to shape a really good innovation. Also think about how tight or loose to be with your innovation. So if it's something new, you might need to be quite agile, trying something out, adapting quickly, getting feedback, evaluating it as you go and tweaking it. If you're trying to use something that's more established and that has a strong evidence base already, you might want to deliver it with a bit more fidelity. So it might be much tighter in terms of its implementation. We also talk about what we call the assessment cycle, which is based on a theory in policy analysis about starting off by identifying pain points to understand a problem, then thinking through the different options, making an evidence-based decision, planning the implementation really carefully, and evaluating it. So we've got that cycle, which is exemplified throughout the report. So if I think back to what this report tells me in relation to my time in teaching and that crazy demand of the 15 hours a week, what I did in that situation was to unilaterally decide that I was just not going to do it. I couldn't comply with it and I wouldn't comply with it. But that was quite a risky approach to take. I wasn't evaluating what I was doing. It wasn't based on any evidence. And so when I look at this report and what it provides to teachers, I like to think that I'm kind of repaying a debt towards responsibility by trying to help people to innovate with more responsibility so that they can build that better future for assessment.
Thank you very much, Loic. So now I think we're going to move on to Rod, who's going to tell us about a bit more about some of the findings in this report.
Great, thank you, thank you, William and Loic, and morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you today and to have worked with Loic and the marvelous Centre for Education on Youth on this very, very timely report. I mean, who would have thought that when we began this work 2 years ago, that assessment would be front and centre of the education debate in the way that it is today? Because with the pandemic forcing school closures and exam cancellations this year, the way that students are assessed has really become a very hot topic. And so the stories of the wave makers in this report and their innovations are perhaps even more prescient. Assessment is really important. Somebody once told me that teachers only do two things: instruct and assess. Now, I know that's horribly simplistic, but it does make the point about the importance of assessment. And assessment is, of course, a complex subject, and it's made more so if one, there's a lack of clarity about its purpose, as we just heard from Loic, or two, we don't assess all the right things, or three, we don't understand that given that assessment is inevitably a proxy for what we want and expect to be learned, that we draw the wrong conclusions. An assessment really should empower and not burden great teaching. So our hope is that Making Waves supports the idea that teachers can become empowered to teach, and protecting theirs and their students' well-being because of the huge burden that assessment can sometimes put on what is already a very overburdened profession. Pearson is an awarding body and supports teachers with the resources that they need to deliver better outcomes. And I know that assessments, especially high-stakes exams, have a big impact on people's lives. It's a big responsibility. So that is why we've supported Making Waves and the predecessor report, Testing the Waters. And it's also why we see today's report as the first element of a much broader debate about the role of today's high stakes qualifications and assessments. I think the public expects and teachers deserve that we debate their impact and their role. And I'm going to be saying more about that in the coming weeks. But in the meantime, a big thank you for joining us. And I hope that you find the debate and the stories that you hear today as inspiring as I did.
Thanks very much, Rod. Looking forward to what you will be saying the next few weeks. So we'll move on to Professor Rob Coe, who's obviously one of the country's leading assessment experts, to hear what he makes of the findings in this report. Rob, do you want to tell us what you think?
Thanks, William. Yeah, and thanks everyone for inviting me to share comments and engage in this discussion. Very much looking forward to the breakout groups too and hearing more about the schools. I love this report. It's such a wide range of different innovations and really just proves that change can happen. You know, these are real schools where people have the same constraints, they have the same accountability processes, they had the same budget problems and all of that, and they were able to introduce exciting innovations. I may say there was quite a range of my reactions to the different case studies. Some I thought were spine-tinglingly good, and others toe-curlingly awful. So that's the whole spectrum. All the ones here today I thought were great, by the way, just in case anyone's worried. So there's kind of 3 points that I thought I would try and make briefly here, and really keen to hear what other people's thoughts are. So first of all, what we've got in this report is some great descriptions of innovation. And innovation, as I said, is really important because it puts down a marker. It says this is possible. It can be inspiring to see, but it's quite seductive. And I think we need to just be cautious about what I sometimes call the sparkling lights model of system improvement, where you think you're looking out into the night sky and you see stars brighten. And this is, you know, you're looking out for millions of years waiting, and stars brighten and you think, yeah, that's the system's improving. And what you're not looking at is other stars fading away. So some schools coming good, some parts of schools improving over time, but overall the system's not changing. We're just focusing on the bits that are improving. We're focusing on the good story, and that's fine to do, but just let's not confuse that with genuine system improvement. I also think that innovation itself can sometimes be a bit overrated, that often just doing what you've always done, or even just stopping doing some things, is the biggest payback in terms of improvement. So we can get a bit seduced by innovation, and we need to just hold on to a calm evaluation there. And that's really my second main point, which is about the need for evaluation. I think that's the way out of this challenge about being seduced by innovation that looks great, that if we do proper evaluation, then we will start to know which of these things have worked, and then we can hang on to the ones that have worked. And I was quite struck reading the report by actually the lack of really robust evaluation in most of these studies, or most of these projects. And some of them evaluation is yet to follow, I know, and some of them I think that looks pretty sound as well. And some there probably is evaluation, the detail's not there. But very often the judgment of success seemed to be lots of people have engaged with this, or the people who have been involved in it thought it was great. And I would just say that I think as a guide to whether something is good, is it effective, is it leading to genuine benefits for young people, children and young people who are ultimately the important recipients, then both uptake and perceptions of participants are generally a pretty poor guide, and we probably just need to do a little bit better than that. And finally, let me say a little bit about expertise. One of the things, again, I really loved about this report is how it keeps on saying how important it is for teachers and other people in the system to have expertise in assessment. And I couldn't agree with that more. I think expertise is really, really important. I think people often don't know how much they don't know about assessment. Assessment is something you can do. If you're a teacher, you do it every day. But the crucial thing is to do it well, and to do it well at different levels. And I've been a researcher looking at assessment for many years. I've done lots of assessment projects, assessment development in various different ways. I've worked with a lot of schools in doing assessment. I taught a master's course in assessment. So I've thought a lot about what does expertise mean in assessment. For me, one of the hardest questions is, what do teachers actually really need to know about it? You know, do they need to know the complex theory of item response theory and all the technical stuff? Well, no, probably not. But where's the sweet point that they do actually need to have a good understanding? And nowhere in the report is this really defined, it didn't seem to me. It talks about expertise. So let me offer a definition then for people to challenge, knock down and think about. I think there are broadly two things that teachers do need to know. So one is an understanding of quality. That one of the real challenges in assessment isn't that we do too much of it, or too much of it is summative, or accountability is a bad thing. None of those things are true. What the problem is that a lot of the assessment we do just isn't very good. So quality is the really important thing. What makes an assessment great? What makes it fit for a particular purpose? Poor quality assessment is a waste of time, can also just be misleading. It can give us wrong information. So high quality means having a clear purpose and being fit for that purpose. Technically, we often use the word validity to refer to that. And what do teachers need to be able to recognize whether an assessment is good or not? Is it fit for purpose? They need to be able to create high quality assessments, but also improve assessments. So if they've got one that is on the way to being high quality, they can make it even better. So that's number one. Number two, what teachers need to know is an appreciation of the limitations of assessment. No assessment is perfect. No assessment gives you the complete truth. All assessments have error in technical terms, or chance, if you like, plays a part. And whenever we're using assessment, we use assessments to make decisions, and we should take account of the limitations. We should know what those limitations are, and we should take account of them in questions like, how much weight should I put on this score or this grade or this answer to this single question in informing a particular decision? All assessments have limits to their precision. They have different amounts of information or weight of evidence, and balancing different kinds of assessments and other kinds of information is the best way to support decision making. So teachers do need to have, I think, some understanding of that, the limitations and the weight that can be put on particular assessments. So those are my thoughts, and I'm really keen to hear everyone else's.
Thanks very much, Rob. Yeah, if anybody, as I said in the chat, if people do have questions, tell us what you think about what Rob's just said, and enter them there, and then we can have a chat in a minute. So next on to Mary Myatt, the chair of the Centre for Education and Youth, for her response.
Thank you very much, William, and I'm delighted to give my headline thoughts on the Making Waves report. So 3 elements I'm going to talk to. So the first is the overall impression in terms of the way that structures have possibly been moving on through this piece of work. Just to pull up 3 examples that I thought were really interesting and for me held a lot of promise. And then just some of the headlines for what I see as the ongoing tensions as we move this agenda and conversation on. So I think it's fair to say that there's no quick fixes as far as this is concerned. And I think that the report exemplifies that extremely well. But what it did strike me was that through this process, there appeared to be a high level of engagement in the research. And that, I think, is a good thing in terms of laying out the framework, the scope against which we can, first of all, work out whether it's going to have any traction in our schools, but also just extending our knowledge. So, for instance, I noticed that the work both of Rob Coe, Daisy Christodoulou, Becky Allen and Dylan William were referenced. And it seemed to me that just in that process, that's going to expand people's knowledge and understanding of this important aspect of provision. To turn to three really interesting examples within the report. So one from the science department at Heathfield School, where that seemed to me particularly interesting, where there was a trial of homework assessment tasks with two parallel groups. So you had got a control group and then an experimental group, and to compare the difference between interleaving learning from earlier weeks with more recent testing in terms of the homework. And it became clear very early on that the interleaving had greater impact on pupil outcomes in terms of the measurements that they were able to gauge. So that raised an ethical question about moving over to this way of working for the other groups sooner than was anticipated. So I thought that was a really nuanced, reflective process, which I thought is worth highlighting. The second is the Shine at Eltham, at the Eltham School. And what particularly struck me about that was not just that this was intentionally set out to engage pupils who might be either falling behind or for all sorts of complex reasons might be termed disadvantaged. And I don't just mean children from poorer communities, but have been very intentionally set out. And what I thought was incredibly powerful was the inclusion of an expert professional artist to comment on the students' work. So there's lots going on there in terms of raising aspirations, raising the quality of the work, because we know there's plenty of indicators that when any of us, including pupils and students, are producing something for an audience that's going to be critiqued, standards tend to rise. And that's at the heart of Ron Berger's work, The Ethic of Excellence. So I found that absolutely fascinating. There seem to be all sorts of effective consequences to that as well. And then the third one I wanted to highlight was the laser conversations at the Midlands Academy Trust. A really brave decision to dump the data. I would highly endorse that, wholeheartedly endorse that. I think that's a message that needs to get out across the sector, which leads me to my third area that I want to just mention is that where I see some of the issues are in terms of taking this forward. So I think that what came through with some of the case studies is that sitting behind the quality of assessment is subject knowledge. And this is particularly important when there are misconceptions. And so we need to know that those are misconceptions. So the whole loop comes back to the quality of the material that's offered to children and the subject knowledge of teachers. For my money, this is the most important school improvement piece of work, not just because it's in the quality of education judgment, but because this just makes so much difference to all our children. How can we identify misconception if we don't know ourselves? This is not a blame game. This is about additional training and support. The second area that I think we need to pay attention to is time. And just at one level, quite often assessment information coming out of lessons is not gathered intentionally or appropriately. So there's what I call the curse of content coverage to move on to the next part of the lesson or the next piece of the content, without having that information about whether our children have actually learnt what we've taught them. So just in that very nuanced moment by moment, I've got some concerns that we need to slow down the pace to be appropriate to learning, to gather that information. The next area that I'm concerned about as we take these conversations forward is there's still a widespread misconception across the sector that progress is linear, and it's not. And so we have all sorts of systems, tracking systems, monitoring systems that make this assumption. And what happens then is that these can mask gaps in children's learning. And since the levels have gone in 2014, we still have systems for the most part. I'm not talking about every school, but we still have too many systems within schools that are working to a levels agenda, even though that has gone. So we need a complete reframing of how we gather evidence of how well our children are doing. The curriculum itself is the progression model. Need to get our heads around that. And that's why I was so excited to read about the laser conversations at the Midland Academy Trust. Doesn't sit neatly on a spreadsheet, but actually gives us far greater information. The final thing I want to have a rant about is that I've been a governor in 3 schools and a trustee in a multi-academy trust. I have never had an accurate sense of how well the children are currently doing in the school, because I've just been presented with numbers. So there's a seductive aspect to numbers on a spreadsheet. And I think there's a huge piece of work that we need to be cracking on and talking about. How do we have a sense of how the children are doing currently in the school? Because at the moment, we've still got in secondary schools using levels for GCSE at Key Stage 3, complete and utter nonsense. And so doesn't provide the information that we need. There's a real issue of validity and reliability within with sitting behind these, and they're absolute proxies for nonsense. They're not even proxies for learning. So what I'd like to see is far greater use of multiple choice, huge amounts of imaginative work going on there, and Daisy Christodoulou's and Chris Whedon's work on comparative judgment seem to me, conversations around those as being more productive than staying locked into what I call dodgy data. So I'm delighted that this report has stimulated what I think is going to be ongoing conversations about how we get this right, both for colleagues, the adults, and then the children in our classrooms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Some really interesting points and advice there. So we've got some, we'll do the Q&A now. We've got a few questions coming in, which is great, but keep putting them in. The first one I'd like to start on is from Rachel Higginson, and this is a question for the whole panel. She's saying there seems to be a conflict in schools between assessment for accountability purposes, outcomes, and assessment as the beating heart of our profession. What does everybody think about that? Rob, would you like to start us off on that one, please?
Okay, yeah, this is one that puzzles me a little bit. I mean, I do understand how this can be felt as attention, but it just shouldn't be. Accountability, well, it depends what you mean by accountability, but the idea that we have summative assessments that capture what children can know and can do and allow us to track their progress. I'm still struggling a bit to get over Mary's comment about never having good information about how well children are doing. That just seems like, what are we getting wrong here then? That's the most fundamental thing. But that's the kind of thing that accountability information should be telling us. And yes, we should also be using assessment for more diagnostic purposes, to give us insights into what children know and can do, and at a more granular level that we can respond to as teachers in a more direct way. We might call that formative if we thought that was a useful word to use. So I don't quite see how this is a conflict. I think there are different kinds of assessment for different kinds of purposes. I mean, I think accountability can be perceived as something that is done to you, that is not part of your own agenda. And mostly that is when it's done badly, actually. So it comes back to this question about quality. If we're doing poor quality assessment that doesn't actually contain information, that has these seductive but meaningless numbers that takes hours and hours to type into spreadsheets and nobody does anything with, well, then that I can see there's a conflict there. But if we're doing sensible things with good assessment, then it's not obvious to me how a conflict can arise, but perhaps I'm missing that.
Mary, do you think this conflict has anything to do with some of the, well, do you think there is a conflict, and do you think it has, if there is, do you think it's got anything to do with some of the problems you raised?
Yes, I do think there's a conflict, particularly when data is used within schools for performance appraisal targets. It completely distorts the system. I think it's fundamentally dishonest. I'm not saying the individuals themselves are dishonest, but if I'm held accountable for my children making so many points per year, goodness, they're going to make them, aren't they? So, and that again masks children not, with gaps. But if we're thinking about the external data for schools, which is a completely different kettle of fish, that does have some, it does have validity and reliability. It's never perfect. There always needs to be some commentary around it. But those external tests at Key Stage 2, 4 and 5, when they're running, they are across a huge population of hundreds of thousands of children all taking the same test material, and they're moderated. Plenty of flaws within that, but I think we can talk with some confidence about those outcomes. But when that gets linked, which I think is what Rachel is suggesting, with accountability for me as an individual and as a professional, so that, say for my GCSE results, my children have to make so much progress, added value. Well, I might have only taught them for a year, and I might not have been very good, but they've had 4 great years behind me, under their belt, but I get the benefit of it. And in primary, this is just as bad. The same with the year 6 teacher. Could be stunning, but the children have had a lot of supply cover afterwards, so they haven't met the progress measures. Absolutely flawed. And I think, we need to crack this open. It's deeply unfair for the individuals. And as I say, I think it's a fundamentally dishonest system.
Thanks, Mary. Rod, I was interested, it's kind of linked, but how much do you think the kind of changes to assessment that schools are making, that are talked about in this report, that kind of grassroots thing, do you think that's going to play into the exam system and the accountability system that your board plays such a part in?
Yes, well, look, I do think that teachers taking control of assessments and using it in the right way is really critical. I remember once I was on a panel with Brian Cox, and I was in the green room with him before, just explaining how the exam system works and about accountability and what have you. And he said to me, "Oh, so you mean that what you're saying is these exams, it's like sticking a probe into children to find out how good their teachers are." So it's quite an emotional subject. I tend to take personally a more nuanced, I think there's a more nuanced view of it. The point about assessment is you're trying to use it to assess what's being learned, essentially. If you flip it the other way around and you try to teach what's being assessed, you can start getting into trouble. And you can certainly blame the accountability system for that. And it could have a role in it, but it's not the only thing. And I think it's important that teachers do have the power to make decisions about these things, and school leadership teams have the power to make decisions. If the assessment becomes the end goal rather than the means to the end goal, then it starts becoming a bit of an issue. Of course, when you've got a high stakes qualification, it is also an end goal. But nevertheless, even high stakes qualifications are also a proxy for what people have learned, and people need to understand that the role that they play as well. So I think putting assessment in context really matters, and giving teachers the tools, knowledge, capability to be able to do that is really, really important. And I think that's why this report is so important, because it's giving teachers those tools to put assessment in context.
Sure. Thanks, Rod. We've got an interesting one from Michael Walker, who's making his point is that this is less about innovation, and that comparative judgment goes all the way back to 1927, and that this is more about sharing what we already know, which I know is one of the key points on the report. So his question is, and maybe Loic, if you could start off on this, how do we share what we already know in assessment?
Yeah, well, I think part of the rationale for this report is to get that conversation going and to do some of that sharing. So as some of you know, we did kick off this project with a crowdsourcing exercise, really going out there to the sector and saying, what are you up to? Let's shine a light on it. So I think exercises like this are really important. I think the role of research fair is critical. And I think we are seeing a profession that's becoming much more interested in these things. This report is the successor to Testing the Water that we published a few years ago. And back then, I think that conversation wasn't as active. And since then, partly through the championing by people like Rob and Daisy and so on, I think this has become something people are much more interested in and therefore much more likely to talk about. And certainly some of the discussions you see going on Twitter and so on are really, really exciting, because they provide that opportunity for people to share what's going on in their classroom.
Thanks, Loic. Jenny Griffiths has got a question which I think is worth asking to everybody. She's saying, is part of the problem that we try to use the same assessment approaches and measures, for example, grades, for different subjects where progress might look very different? Who'd like to take that one? Rob, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I think this is that on the surface looks like a little bit of a problem, and then you scratch in and you realise the whole thing starts to unwind. What do grades mean? What does it mean for grades to be comparable across different subjects? How should we be using grades, and so on? So we could spend the whole day, I guess, arguing about those things, and I know we're not going to, because we've got lots of other things more pressing and interesting. Well, I think that would be interesting, but I might be the only person. Perhaps me, Jenny, I don't know. Anyway, so I think actually, again, good assessment can solve this problem. Good standardization, I think, comparability processes, when that's done well, it can be meaningful to talk about equivalent levels of performance across different subjects, and actually to talk about progress journeys in a quantified way. But it's only possible to do with the right kind of assessment underpinning it. And so assessments need to be designed for that purpose, if that's the purpose we want to use them for, and they need to be validated and good quality for that purpose, if that's what we want them to do. And so it comes back to this question about understanding, what does that mean then? What in practice, what does an assessment need to look like to be good quality?
Thanks. Rod, you're obviously all your exams have got grades. Do you think there's any issue there about using the same grades in different subjects, or that's a different point?
I wouldn't say that there's a problem there with using a consistent, idea of grading across subjects, because I think consistency helps. It's a language people understand. It is important that the assessment approach reflects the subject that's being, or the content, or what it is that you're expecting to be learned, obviously. And to the best of our ability, I think all the exam boards do design that in, so you get different kinds of assessment for different kinds of knowledge that's expected to be learned. You've also got to set that against making sure that the assessment is rigorous and reliable, and that, so this is why consistency of approach using exams, or sometimes a mixture of exams and coursework, matters. So I don't actually see a fundamental problem with how exams are done. I think you do need some consistency and grading approach across different subjects.
Sure.
Can I just jump in there on I think there's a point here about comparability and subject specific when it comes to qualifications and exams that I think Rob have responded to there. But I think there's also the question of the more day-to-day assessment in school. And Mary mentioned the example of the assessment innovation team at Heathfield, which we study in this report. And one of the reasons that was a particularly interesting example was because that involved different innovations in different departments. And therefore it did allow the subject-specific nature of assessment to come to the fore, which was really relevant there because Mary talked about the example of the science teaching where they were looking at interleaving. But if you looked at the photography department, and you can see some of the photography on the front cover of the report, what we had there was a head of photography who took a very different approach because that was what was appropriate to the subject and what they were seeking to do day to day in their classroom. So that's one of the reasons why I say that a key finding in this report is that when you're trying new things in assessment, you want to embed that within your subject discipline, and middle leaders and heads of department taking a role in shaping assessment within their particular subject at secondary school can be a really powerful approach.
Thanks, Loic. Got an interesting one from Claire Larkin, who's a school governor and not an assessment expert, and she wants to know how she can be sure that her school is evaluating, or any school is evaluating the assessment systems that they use effectively. Mary, would you like to take that one?
Yes. So the simplest question to ask, I think, is just to ask what do these standards mean and how have they arrived at them? That'll expose the depth of the thinking, it seems to me. And if they're on progress measures, particularly in secondary, well, it happens in primary as well, but in secondary, on what basis are those being judged, particularly at Key Stage 3, when we shouldn't be using the criteria being used at the end of Key Stage 4, but it seems to be practice in lots of contexts, complete nonsense, distorts the curriculum. But I think for me, the most productive conversations from a governance point of view, whether that's as a governor or as a trustee, is to have some proper conversations when exams are going, whether it's the SATs, GCSEs, BTECs and A-levels. You can have some proper conversations around those for all the reasons that I've said earlier. But what concerns me is that what is being presented for the most part is neither valid nor reliable, and so it's some questions around that, and just on what evidence are they drawing those conclusions. It seems to me that we need to see far more of the work that I identified earlier in terms of the laser conversations, and I would also supplement that with samples of children's work. Not as neat and tidy on a spreadsheet, but you really get a sense of where children are with some samples.
Sure. Thanks, Mary. Back to accountability with a question from Simon Sharp, who's saying, given that the accountability is consistently being cited as a distorting influence on assessment, where should we be looking for helpful innovations on school accountability measures that can support rather than hamper effective assessment arrangements? Rob, could you give us your thoughts on that?
Sorry, I'm able to speak muted there. That would be terrible. So can I just make a quick comment on the previous one as well, because it's such a good question, really hard question, really important question. We're going to know whether what a school is doing in assessment is appropriate and high quality. You know, I talked about quality, and here I am being challenged. So, you know, give us some practical advice here. So I think the answer is you can't. If you're not an expert in assessment, it's very hard to know, but there are some things you could do. So one is there anyone in the school who is an expert? What kind of specialist training does any person in that school have in assessment? I'd want to know that. I'd want to know the kind of processes that people have gone through to develop any assessments they're using. just to have that described to me and judge whether it sounds plausible or not. I'd want to know some technical information about those assessments, like their reliability, like their predictive validity, for example. But if you're not an expert, that probably isn't a very helpful thing. But there should be someone in that school who knows enough to know about those things. Okay, so let me answer your question then, which is about helpful innovations on school accountability measures. Accountability is just such a dark, unknown area in our knowledge about how to make schools better. I think we have a little bit of evidence that says some kinds of accountability seem to be at the system level, seem to lead to better outcomes than having none at all. But we know so little about how to optimize the kinds of accountability we do. And accountability as it's perceived by teachers is often very controlling, very negative. We're very conscious of all the dysfunctional side effects that are not intended, but seem to be inevitable somehow about the games people play and everything from just wasted time through to cheating. And it seems to me that we need to have a much more test and learn approach to how we do accountability, that you can't design this from your desk. You need to try out some different systems. Let's have some school-led leadership in the system that says, here's a group of schools, we want to try this model of accountability, give us the headroom to do it, but then evaluate really robustly whether it's working and under what conditions it's working. Because it's very easy to put forward suggestions to innovate, but it's actually really hard to create systems that generate more benefits than downsides. And I honestly don't think we have good knowledge about how to do that, and we really need to learn that.
Thanks. We're nearly running out of time for questions. I've just got one I wanted to ask myself, which is, this is about grassroots change. So to Loic, you've described these schools as being in the vanguard. Are they part of something very big at the moment, or is this just happening in a few isolated places? And Rod, how much call for change are you getting from teachers from the grassroots? Do you get a lot of feedback from the profession about how exams should be changed? Sorry, if we go to Loic first.
Sure. Well, I don't have a reliable way of assessing the prevalence of this kind of innovation. So I'd be wary of making any very strong claims based on that. But what I would say is that we were impressed when we did the crowdsourcing by how many people were coming forward with ideas. But I think we had to go through a careful process in selecting which ones to look into. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the time people haven't done some of that really important work around thinking, what purpose is each assessment serving? What are we basing this idea on? What is the rationale? So we were not assessing them based on whether they were proven to have worked. We were interested in the theory of change that sat behind them, because we wanted to look at things that worked and things that didn't work, to understand the process of the innovation. But what we did want to see was that coherent theory of change behind it. And one of the things I would definitely flag up is that I hope that what we start to see is a lot more of that kind of innovation being based on a robust understanding of what they're trying to achieve and how and why they think they're going to successfully do that.
Thanks, Loic. Rod, sorry, just squeeze that in.
Well, look, we're getting a lot of feedback right now, of course, because of concerns over, what happened this summer on exams and what might happen next summer. So, and we want to make sure that there is fairness in general, and also sort of, to sort of take account of concerns over any differential sort of learning loss and what have you. So we're getting lots of feedback, having lots of discussions right now for understandable reasons. I think, and obviously we're working with government, with regulators to work our way through all of this and do our utmost to ensure fairness for summer. I think, though, in addition to that, this is a very specific issue, pandemic related, that we're working our way through at the moment. But I think it's also sort of, to an extent, catalyzed a broader conversation to some extent with teachers, but other sort of stakeholders in the system who are sort of asking questions about, well, you know, let's have a bit of a rethink about this. So there are some broader questions, some of which you've published, William, in the TES around the future of assessment. And we think this is a good time to start that conversation, and we will be reaching out. We do work with teachers, of course. Our assessment, the people that mark and design our exam papers are teachers, so they're already deeply engaged in the system. But we think this is a good time to also start a somewhat broader conversation, just to make sure we're reflecting and we've got things right in terms of what the qualifications are, how they interact with the accountability system, to make sure we're delivering the very best outcomes for young people.
Brilliant. Thanks everybody for some great questions and some fascinating answers. Loic, I think, is going to explain what's going to happen now with the breakout rooms.
Okay, this is where it all becomes a bit exciting. Not that it hasn't been exciting already, but we're gonna move into our breakout rooms. It looks like the pre-assignment hasn't quite worked, which was not unexpected. However, what we can do is we're actually going to put up the different breakout rooms. So a lot of the people you've heard about, Midlands with her laser conversations, Rosie and her artist, Bensworth with her work with Impact Ed, colleagues who've joined us all the way from New Zealand in the middle of the night. And so lots of people to hear from, and you will see the options come up in a second. And if you could just select the breakout room you want to go into, and we'll have 15 to 20 minutes in that room for you to hear a little bit more detail about the practice. So if you're okay to set up the breakout rooms, Baz, and people can make their choices. And we've got a little bit of a reminder of who is speaking coming up on the screen at the moment.
Just to let everyone know that unfortunately Mike, who is going to run the Isaac physics session, hasn't been available today, this morning. He's been called away. So if you were planning to attend that session, then please direct your preference to one of the other lovely rooms that we've got.
Oh, Jeremy, it's nice to see your face, having read all about you. Jeremy is the artist who Rosie worked with. Those of you didn't get a chance to meet.
I'm sure that he'd be keen to work with any other schools that are interested. So please get in touch with us if you want to know more about the project.
Careful, you're going to be in big demand. Fantastic. Great. Right. We're just going to round off. I can't see you. Are you still here, William? Stuart?
Yeah, sorry.
Right. That's all right.
Go off on my, yeah, I am.
Cool. I'll let you round this off then.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody that contributed. I think, as I said, it is really interesting to hear what's actually going on in schools themselves, and just work out what can actually work. So yeah, so thanks to Loic, thanks to Mary, Rod, and Rob, and everybody, and everybody who ran the breakout rooms and contributed with questions. It's been a great morning. Thank you very much.
Thanks all. And yeah, you can download the report from our website now, from cfey.org. And please do, now that it's public and that it's out there, please share it widely. Hashtag is making waves. And I'd like to say a big thank you too to everyone. I've found it so interesting studying your journeys and everything you've been doing over the last few years. So it's been a fantastic journey. And I'm really looking forward to hearing feedback and thoughts on it. Thank you very much.